Hi guys, Darryl Griffiths here for JumpCut Online once again. I hope you've all been well. Of course, I'm back from Glasgow Film Festival now, back in a wet and windy West Midlands here. That's not to say that reviews have dried up. I have 2 to go, including this one, and of course I hope you enjoy them, fingers crossed. The first film I'm going to tackle is White Riot. It was the winner of Best Documentary Feature at last year's London Film Festival, and of course slowly working its way around the festival circuit, and was revealed at a Q&A afterwards that the film is aiming for a summer release in the UK. Directed by Rubika Shah, and it leads us through, for certainly a younger generation, a movement that surprisingly hasn't really been highlighted before, at least on a cinematic canvas. It was the Rock Against Racism movement, which went down in the 1970s. It culminated in a huge concert in Trafalgar Square at the back end of the 1970s. They expected a mere 500. They were quite modest in their expectations. But this movement spread like wildfire across the UK, and its mission statement was pretty simple. It was to tackle the rise of the far right in this country and the National Front, when the likes of Enoch Powell were quite prominent. And the Rock Against Racism movement was founded by a photographer and activist called Red Saunders, and we get a real insight into how this movement was formed. It is proper grassroots activism at a time when it's very similar. It will draw stark comparisons to what we're dealing with in the UK right now in terms of immigration, and again the rise of the far right, which I think is not just in this country. It's spread across America and Russia and so forth, and these very warped ideologies that are twisting people's minds and pinning the blame for social deprivation and that kind of thing on people that ultimately aren't responsible for it. You need to look a bit higher up, guys, as far as I'm concerned. But the movement, in a musical sense, it all stemmed from the fierceness and integration of punk rock and reggae, essentially. So you've got the likes of Stiff Little Fingers, The Clash, Steel Pulse, all these kind of bands. I mean, it's not a genre that I know like hugely. Of course I know The Clash and various other bands, so people might be a bit more well informed in picking out certain details of the bands and the likes of Joe Strummer and so forth, but they were prominent figures in tackling or spearheading this movement that Red Saunders was so passionate to impose upon the country as a refreshing and inclusive counterpoint to all the bigotry and racism that was rife within the UK in the 1970s. And it's an exhilarating call to arms in a cinematic sense, and how Rubika Shah, the director, brings this story to life for us, as I say, particularly for a younger generation who is rolling his eyes to what's going on politically at the moment, and these buffoons that we've put into power, and the way they've just sort of shrouded themselves in, you know, this sort of positive light, which ultimately is just not true. And I think the most potent remark that Red Saunders makes within the film, drawing it back to the 1970s, was it was the Union Jack that was ultimately revealed as a swastika, which is quite a powerful image to have implanted on your mind. But that's sort of where we're at. For me, you look at the national flag and people, it does draw, in comparison to other countries, you do get a sense of people aren't necessarily as passionate about waving it around in people's faces as much as they used to be, because it does carry a lot of negative connotations. And the insight that we get to the racism and bigotry is startling. But in this current climate, it shouldn't shock you, really. there were people who were involved in this movement who had to put sand as you enter the front door, in the fear of petrol being poured through the letterboxes being shut up, because it was just, there was many clashes along the way, and trying to bring a sense of positivity through music. And I think this is the beautiful thing about the film, or the documentary, is that the music, I think the arts are getting so torn apart in terms of funding and that kind of thing, and there's sort of this idea that musicians and actors and so forth shouldn't impose their politics on people, but then you look at what remarks are made by singers back in the 70s, with Eric Clapton being the most prominent figure, doesn't come out very well here, and was a big supporter of Mykaell at that time, and the politics that he peddled, and there were remarks that Rod Stewart made and David Bowie, which were quite questionable at the time, but the politics of music and film are ultimately, if we buy into what they're selling, essentially, particularly if you look at Eric Clapton's case, which they really do tear apart, and sort of he plays soul music, but you're fueled by bigotry and oppression of people of colour, and you're basically running away with all the money from music that is ultimately stemmed particularly from black community. It's just insane to me. But this is sort of the subtlety of racism, and sort of how people just sort of gloss over it a lot of the time, and when you actually unpick it, there's a lot of racial undercurrent or bigoted undercurrents to what they're putting out there. And I think if you look at the way politicians are at the moment, not to get too high and mighty, but a lot of the lies that they peddle, and for me, I think there's an element, although it's fictionalized stories, a lot of the time there is this element of truth that pierces through the arts, and I think this is an exhilarating, ultimately very hopeful take on the idea and the power of the arts against, a very uncertain time and a very dark time at the moment, that hopefully we can emerge from the wilderness a little bit. But the way it's all captured through Rubika Shah's direction, I think the wonderful thing to make it really current and youthful is the animation of almost the fanzines that they ultimately were handing out at that time, and it's so inventive, and the creativity is literally dripping from every little piece of animation that sort of feeds its way into the narrative here. But White Riot, don't just take it at face value with its title, because with the song White Riot, people did sort of ultimately take it as just it was like white power, and it was like sort of nationalistic vibe they were going for, the National Front at the time. And if you actually unpick the lyrics, don't take it at surface level, for goodness sake. White Riot is fantastic. I hope it gets the summer release it craves, because I think this is a very apt documentary for our time. Considering it was made 5 years ago, it's quite some hindsight if you think about it, with the likes of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump lurking around at the moment. But that is a wrap on my review of White Riot. Be sure to look out for this one, because just the fire and the ferocity that it drives home its message, I'm sure will really resonate with people, so look out for it. That is a wrap-on review of White Riot. JumpCut Online, Facebook, like our page, Twitter, JumpCut_online, the website, www.jumpcutonline.co.uk, the Patreon page, of course. All the details are on our JumpCut Online website also. The final review that I'm going to drop is Calm with Horses with Cosmo Jarvis and Barry Cohen, so be sure to look out for that as well. that I've been Daryl Griffiths, and I will see you soon, guys. Take care, and bye bye for now. See you later.